Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to the National Nuclear Security Administration Nuclear Deterrence Forum. This is a joint effort of the Mitchell Institute and the Advanced Nuclear Weapons Alliance Deterrence Center. Each event in this series will feature senior leaders in key areas of nuclear security with the intent to increase awareness and foster positive discussion toward achieving our nation's nuclear security objectives. We're very pleased that Mr. Drew Walter could join us today. Mr. Walter is currently performing the duties of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Matters, and he serves as a focal point for issues related to the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile, nuclear counterterrorism, and nuclear counterproliferation. Prior to his current position, Mr. Walter served as Senior Advisor to the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, working to integrate efforts related to nuclear deterrent modernization and sustainment. Prior to joining the Department of Defense, Mr. Walter served as a professional staff member with the House Armed Services Committee, as well as a senior member of the staff at Sandia National Laboratories. Now, to kick off the session, we first have a short presentation by Mr. Jeff Crater from ANWA about the importance of modernizing our nation's nuclear deterrent. So Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, General. Again, thank you, General Deptula. Again, I'm Jeff Crater. My colleague David Sherrington and I co-founded the Advanced Nuclear Weapons Alliance with these forums in mind as a bipartisan environment to educate the public and interested parties about the key issues around modernization of our nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. We're pleased to partner with the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies today and into the future to bring you this 6-part series on the NNSA. So fundamentally, we ask the question, why do we have a strategic nuclear deterrent? And as this slide portrays, during World War II, at the close of World War II, 70 million people, that's both soldiers and civilians, died in World War II. That's 8 million in Germany, that's 20 million in China, that's 24 million in Russia. And our strategic nuclear deterrent prevents tens of millions more from death. In other words, the deterrent prevents another atrocity like those that are demonstrated on this bar graph. The red signifying 70 million deaths during World War II, to prevent that from occurring again or World War III. So deterrence preserves peace and prosperity, something attributed to President Eisenhower at the start of the Cold War. And then towards the close of the Cold War, Morning Again in America, a 1984 re-election campaign ad, Reagan re-elect ad that discusses this prosperity we experienced under his presidency during the buildup that ultimately brought the Soviets to their knees. In those remarkable words, President Reagan, standing before the Berlin Wall in 1987, he said, "President Gorbachev, as we all know and remember, tear down this wall." So the Cold War ended and post-Cold War downsizing rather abruptly began. Strategic nuclear deterrence was dramatically reduced. Weapon systems were dramatically reduced, and many lost their jobs associated with deterrence. A decade later, 9/11 happened. Terrorism hit the United States for the first time in many years. The nation mourned, and the counterterrorism and military buildup started overseas. Deterrence modernization essentially was put on the back burner. And so it goes. While America and our allies fight global terrorism, and rightly so, China and Russia modernize their strategic nuclear forces. Starting under Obama and doubling down under Trump with bipartisan support from Congress, we've stopped kicking the can on strategic nuclear deterrence modernization. And we're on a 30-year, $1.2 trillion trajectory that includes both maintenance of our strategic nuclear deterrent as well as modernization to modernize our deterrent replacing B-52s, as you see there, with the B-21 and nuclear-capable F-35s. Replacing Minuteman III with GBSD, the ground-based strategic deterrent, with modern ICBMs, and replacing the aging Ohio class with Columbia, with upgraded Trident II D5 missiles. NNSA has been modernizing throughout the decade, but much more needs to be done at the weapons plants and national laboratories to maintain, and in many cases, restore our capability, and yes, restore what we've left to atrophy over the years to manufacture nuclear materials and the warheads themselves. And I thank you very much, and back to you, General.
Well, thanks, Jeff, for that overview. Now let's turn this over to our guest of honor and welcome Drew. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. Let's start by giving you an opportunity to give us your thoughts on the current status of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, the critical challenges facing your team, and some of your top priorities. So over to you, Drew.
Great. Thank you, General. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate being invited to speak with you all today. And I greatly appreciate Mitchell Institute and ANWA and continue to host these events. Even in our pandemic world, these events are critical to engage with the stakeholders, provide facts and perspectives, and just inform the debate that I know we're going to have this year as we have every year. So although it's difficult to tell who's out there on Zoom, I'm sure I know many of you, and hopefully some of you know me from my previous position on Capitol Hill. I spent many a morning having eggs and bacon in the Capitol Hill Club, listening to Deterrence Forum perspectives and speakers, and flinging the occasional curveball question at the speakers. So in proof that karma is real, I'm anticipating and looking forward to everyone's curveballs at the conclusion of this. I also ask forgiveness if my two girls walk through the background. I've attempted to bribe them with ice cream and iPads. So, but I'm really excited to be a part of this six-part series focused on NNSA. I've been in and around NNSA my entire career, starting as an engineer and analyst at Sandia National Laboratories, and then with Congress on the House Armed Services Committee overseeing and authorizing NNSA. And now at DoD as the acting DASD for nuclear matters, my office is the primary liaison into NNSA and its labs and plants, and helping translate perhaps back and forth between NNSA and the Department of Defense. So very excited to be here. I understand the direction, about 10 minutes or so on the nuclear deterrent as it stands today, where we may be headed, and some priorities and challenges. Taking that direction, let me start at the end with challenges and kind of work my way back. So you've probably heard this before from senior DoD officials, but let me emphasize, despite the actions by the United States to lead the world in reducing reliance on nuclear weapons, US adversaries have gone in the other direction and placed greater emphasis on modernizing and expanding their nuclear arsenals. Although effective today, our US nuclear deterrent remains dependent on aging weapons, aging delivery systems, aging NC3, and aging infrastructure, systems that were built in the Cold War and are well beyond, most of them, their original design lives. After 25 years focused on reducing the number of US nuclear weapons in our stockpile and extending the life of those that remain, repeated decisions to defer recapitalization of the weapons and delivery systems and facilities, those repeated decisions have caught up to us. Those decisions, however reasonable they may have been and seemed at the time and in isolation, over time and in aggregate, they have painted us into quite a sticky corner. Due to the decades of deferred investments, we must pursue simultaneous, just-in-time replacement of the forces, warheads, and infrastructure that underpins the enterprise. And as you've heard many times from DoD leaders much more senior to me, including in the previous administration, delay is no longer an option. The long-standing warnings and repeated warnings we've had and heard about the need to modernize and recapitalize, that's no longer a warning about the future. It is today. The modernization mountain, as some have called it, is no longer out there on the horizon. We're climbing it right now. As Jeff alluded to, for several years now, stretching back into the Obama administration, the administration and Congress have been putting our money where our mouths are at, and really where we started talking in 2010. Let me explain, and I'm gonna throw a couple figures at you. Some of you may recall the 1251 report, as it's called, morphed into the 1043 report and other names. But the bottom line is, in late 2010 and early 2011, the Obama administration published a report that outlined how it was going to modernize and recapitalize the full triad: delivery systems, weapons, and infrastructure. And it committed to providing NNSA over the period from FY12 to FY20, approximately $80 billion for those activities. So in the interest of putting our money where our mouth is, I'm pleased to report that with the money Congress provided in FY19 and FY20, that cumulative ledger is now in the black by a couple $2 billion. So the Trump administration has kept that strong commitment going with the FY21 budget request. In FY21, for instance, NNSA would receive an increase of 18% versus FY20, the previous year, 25% if you do the math for weapons activities specifically. Some have said that seems like a lot. So I'll offer, on the DoD side, it is fully aligned. On the DoD side, our proposed FY21 budget request for operating, sustaining, and modernizing our nuclear systems is an 18% increase over FY20. So we are both recognizing in both departments the importance of this mission and that we're in it as partners. We're both climbing that curve that we've known has been coming since 2010. But let's be clear, this still amounts to less than 5% of DoD's budget. And as we go up this curve, it will never amount to more than 7%. For our highest priority mission in the defense of the nation, we're still getting a relative bargain, especially compared to previous rounds of nuclear modernization. Regarding priorities within the nuclear deterrent today, and where we may be headed, since I work in acquisition and sustainment within OSD for Undersecretary Lord, let me say some words from that perspective. In ANS, we take very seriously the Nuclear Posture Review of 2018's charge of, quote, "There is no further margin for delaying US sustainment and replacement programs for our existing nuclear capabilities. We will avoid shortfalls in the next decade only by carefully managing programmatic risk to those programs," close quote. We recognize we must concurrently acquire and field the modern systems, such as GBSD, Columbia, LRSO, B-21, while simultaneously sustaining our current legacy systems, whether that's Minuteman or Ohio or B-52 or Alcom. In ANS, we are repeatedly banging that drum because while everyone focuses on the big ticket, expensive, large acquisition projects, like the ones I mentioned, we must be paying equally careful attention to sustainment of our legacy systems. These systems that I mentioned must run through the tape and be militarily effective until their modern equivalents and replacements come online, or we risk a serious gap in our deterrence posture and ability to meet the requirements of STRATCOM and ultimately the president. Or to use another running metaphor that maybe I like more, we need our current legacy nuclear systems to smoothly hand the baton of deterrence over to their modern replacements as they are fielded. So in ANS and across the services, we're paying a lot of attention to not only keeping the modernization systems on track to ensure they deliver, but also keep the legacy systems effective and fielded until that can happen. And that's been a useful construct for us in ANS. So we focus on the A and the S, and we share that message with as many folks as we can, particularly up in Congress and out in the services, and particularly with the men and women in uniform who are out there day to day operating what are increasingly old, though still effective systems. Finally, let me conclude with a few brief words on the current state of the deterrent and where we're at. Let me be clear, make no mistake, despite its age, our nuclear deterrent is effective and ready. General Hyten has said that. Admiral Richard has said that. It's amazing what our men and women in uniform, the NNSA engineers and scientists out in the field, in the enterprise, as well as our defense industrial base partners, are able to do to keep those systems going and make sure they are ready and able to deter and assure on a daily basis. It is DoD's highest priority mission and is receiving the attention and investment that warrants from DoD and NNSA. We've had 4 secretaries of defense in a row now, stretching back to Secretary Carter and on through current secretary this is the highest priority mission. That statement has been reflected in defense planning guidance, in public statements, and in budget requests. The NNSA enterprise is being recapitalized to be resilient and to be responsive to DoD's requirements. That's been a moniker for the better part of a decade now. These requirements must be based in reality of deterring adversaries and assuring allies for a long time to come. And you see those requirements not only in the warheads programs themselves, but in the strategic materials such as plutonium, uranium, lithium, tritium, those kind of things. We work with NNSA closely to understand what their enterprise capacity and capabilities are, and we fit our requirements and push the NNSA enterprise to deliver what STRATCOM and ultimately the president thinks they need to deter and assure. And then the people in our military and across the NNSA enterprise who form the backbone of the deterrent continue to do amazing things. I'm constantly impressed by, again, the folks who keep these systems going, the creativity and ingenuity of NNSA and its scientists and engineers. They don't get enough kudos. They often take their licks. And I often say I'm both NNSA's biggest fan and harshest constructive critic. But there are certain things NNSA does very well, and pointing out the W76-2, we went from NPR direction, and 2 years later, I got to, as the acting DASD, sign off on declassification of the fact that the system is in the fleet. That's a remarkable quick turn to shore up a key defense and deterrence capability. And I know I sleep a little bit better at night knowing the W76-2 is out there in the fleet, hopefully making Russians sleep a little less good at night. And then even today, with the COVID-19 pandemic having shut down much of global commerce and society and forcing me to talk to you from my basement, US nuclear forces are fully manned and fully ready, and only because they're backed up by the world's best scientists and engineers and production technicians in NNSA. So that's about 10 minutes for you of around the world on priorities and challenges. I know there's lots of good questions out there. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks very much for that perspective, Drew. What I'd like to do now is introduce David Charrington from ANWA to carry on the discussion with you further, beginning with how nuclear issues are understood and perceived on Capitol Hill. So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, General. And Drew, very good to see you. So pleased to see we have so many people on this Zoom call with us. So thank you for joining us. And I'm going to start by, Drew, have a little conversation with you, ask you a few questions and get some of these questions asked here, but I really want to hear from the people, some of the people on the line as well. So get your questions ready, and you'll have a chance to ask some questions in just a few minutes. So, Drew, long professional career on HASC after coming there from laboratory background. So you have a lot of experience on these nuclear issues. Curious your input on, where is Congress? Where do they get this right, and what does Congress most misunderstand? And how this process works. What does Congress need help, if any? We have, really want to make sure that part of why we do this is to educate and raise awareness. Here's a chance to say, what does Congress get right? What do they misunderstand from your perspective?
Sure. So I would say over the past 10 years, stretching back to 2010, 2011, Congress has gotten a lot right. All you need to do is look at the authorization and appropriations for the nuclear deterrent. And while there's many voices on Capitol Hill, 535 different people who and all their staff who have very different opinions. You got to look at the proof in the pudding of the final bills that come out of and go to the president for signature. And by and large, those bills have been positive for the nuclear deterrent. As I alluded to, the commitment made in 2010, 2011 has largely been fulfilled. The programs that have been put forward by the administration, whether it was the previous administration or this administration, have been approved and authorized and are proceeding. And we are climbing up that curve to truly get after the modernization programs that the country has known about for a decade. As we look towards supplemental capabilities, whether it's the 76-2, the SLCM, the W93 that's been proposed in FY21, I'm reasonably confident, maybe cautiously optimistic, that Congress will again see the wisdom in these proposals and see the consistency across many decades of nuclear policy and programs. And ultimately, I don't think there's a misunderstanding on Capitol Hill. I just think there's very different viewpoints, and some of them are fundamentally opposed to. And I mean 180 degrees from each other, and those tend to sort themselves out in the congressional process of speech and debate and ultimately compromise. So as far as what we all can do and should be doing is continuing to have discussions like this, providing facts and information and perspectives to members of Congress, to the staff. And I'll tell you, my mantra was always when I was on Capitol Hill, Congress makes better decisions the more information it has and the more perspectives it hears from. So I certainly encourage everybody, regardless of their view, to engage in their constitutional right to petition the government through Congress.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. So I want to turn to pit production for a couple minutes. And I'm going to refer back to the FY 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, which stipulates that the Nuclear Weapons Council chairman will submit a report clarifying that the plutonium pit production plan of NNSA will meet the military requirement of at least 80 pits per year by 2030. Some have argued for less and others for more, perhaps as a hedge so we can surge in case of an emergency. Talk about your views on this, and does the Nuclear Weapons Council support this number of 80 pits per year by 2030?
In brief answer to that last question, yes, 100%. So my boss, Undersecretary Lord, the chair of the NWC, just signed out her certification this year. That NNSA, that NWC supports the at least 80 pit per year requirement, and NNSA is on track to meet it. Not without risk, and the biggest risk will be ensuring they get the funding and authorization authorities they need to get there. But fully supporting the 80 pit per year requirement. On the larger issue of, is this requirement necessary? I'll step back to, I've lived this movie 4 times now, I think, in the past 15 years. It was started with Modern Pit Facility, and then we made progress on that, spent a lot of money. And then threw that out, and we went to the CMRR nuclear facility concept and spent about $500 million on that design concept until that became too expensive for the country. And then we threw that out. And then we went to this modular strategy at Los Alamos and did that for several years. And then that became untenable. And then we ended up with the 2-site strategy between Los Alamos and Savannah River site. I and the rest of the Department of Defense fully support the 2-site strategy, but I will emphasize I don't want to see this movie a 5th time. We need to have picked this as our way ahead and stick to it. We will see the Savannah River folks will submit their Critical Decision 1 package to NNSA later this year. The NWC will undoubtedly get a chance to review it and see where we're at. I'm hopeful we'll be able to deliver the capability on time, because ultimately, as far as the requirement of at least 80 pits per year, it kind of comes down to simple math. And if you believe that we are probably going to have a stockpile around the size it is now, gross order of magnitude 4,000 operational weapons in the active and inactive reserve, if you have 80 pit per year production capacity, the simple math is you could then turn over the stockpile in about 50 years with new pits. That's a long time, and longer than any pit has really ever lasted, but we're reasonably confident they can last 50 years. If you go to a 30 pit per year production capacity, and again, nominal size of 4,000 weapons, it would take 133 years to turn over the stockpile and ensure there's new pits in the weapons. 133 years. We don't know. The science does not. That's a lot of extrapolation, I guess I'll say, from a technical perspective. But the bottom line is a pit production capacity of 30 pits per year might have made sense to some who thought the size of our stockpile would go down to 1,500 weapons, where again, the math supports turning over the stockpile in 50 years. But that doesn't seem to be where we're headed. The Nuclear Posture Review seemed to put out there a very clear-eyed, realistic assessment of the geopolitical context and nuclear threats. And it doesn't seem like we're going to make huge progress to that small stockpile in the near term. Though I wish Ambassador Billingsley well with his arms control, and maybe we will get there.
Very good, thank you. Very interesting. I'm anticipating there could be follow-up questions on all these, but let me go on. Talking about, you talked about the budget generally. I want to talk about the NNSA budget and ask you about your major issues facing the nuclear labs and infrastructure and that are being addressed in the NNSA budget proposals to Congress this fiscal year. And here we should, focusing on labs and infrastructure, but also some of the programming, stockpile stewardship program and what's happening there. Appreciate your views here.
Sure. So, NNSA takes care of a huge part of the deterrent. The deterrent is not just the missiles and submarines and bombers out there in the field. It's also certainly the warheads that go on them, the infrastructure that underpin them and produce them, and the people in NNSA's enterprise. And frankly, I often think it's the people that actually deter certain adversaries, potential adversaries, the most, because of that creativity and innovation they're capable of. So they are responsible for the care and feeding and modernization of all those things, and handing that baton not just between the warheads of the legacy to the modern stockpile, but the infrastructure and the people, of making sure the people, the skilled scientists and engineers are there. Regarding the key things in the budget proposal, I would say the infrastructure is obviously a big driver, making sure we can build out the Savannah River Plutonium facility, continue production in Tennessee, the building of the uranium production facility, and getting out of those, I'll just say, ancient facilities at Y-12. I've done the Y-12 ugly tour several times in my day, and it doesn't get any prettier. They are working uranium operations in facilities that date to the 1950s. We need to, and those buildings were built of cinder block and designed to last 10 years. We need to get out of those facilities. And so anything we can do to support NNSA to get out of those facilities into modern places where their scientists and engineers and production technicians can really do their jobs without concrete falling from the roof, frankly. But the more widely, getting on top of lithium and tritium production, I'll put in a plug for the Stockpile Responsiveness Program, which allows NNSA scientists and engineers to, again, think creatively and develop technologies that aren't necessarily for any particular weapon system, but to perhaps try things and fail, try things and succeed. As we've seen with SpaceX, boy, that's quite a learning tool. And then finally, I'll also put in a plug for some of the stockpile stewardship capabilities, whether that's the enhanced capabilities for subcritical experiments out in Nevada, which will provide unparalleled diagnostics for subcritical testing that will give us reams of new data to confirm or allay our suspicions on what goes on in the stockpile as it ages. So across the board, NNSA is doing big things. They've got a significant increase in their budget request this year, as does DoD, and looking forward to climbing up this curve together.
Thank you. Let's turn for a couple minutes to Russia and China. So both Russia and China have been modernizing their respective national security capabilities, including their nuclear weapons programs. Just recently, the Chinese media, through the Global Times, reported that China may increase its number of nuclear warheads from a few hundred to 1,000 warheads. Interested in getting your views, as we seek and need to modernize our own strategic nuclear deterrent. How's that done with the backdrop of what's happening in Russia and China? And is this something that the Nuclear Weapons Council plans to address?
Sure. So the Nuclear Weapons Council and its principals get regular intelligence briefings, as do I and others. We're well aware of what Russia and China and others out there in the world are doing, what our intelligence says they are doing, and frankly, what they tell us they are doing. Russia has been pretty clear in March 2018 at President Putin's equivalent of the State of the Union, told us about the four very new, very novel nuclear weapons capabilities that they are pursuing, some of which might be captured by New START, but some of which definitely are not. Whether that's the flying Chernobyl, as it's been called, after the recent accident, or the very super heavy ICBM, or the underwater salt the earth autonomous torpedo, which is strangely frightening. These are weapons designed to leverage their side of the balance. And the Nuclear Weapons Council firmly believes we do not need all of those capabilities to deter Russia, even as they pursue them. But we are pretty clear that as the NPR stated, there are a few supplemental capabilities that we need to pursue to ensure deterrence remains strong. And you've seen those in the W76-2 and the W93. You'll see on the China side, certainly after the DIA director's discussion last year on where the intelligence community assesses China may be going with doubling their stockpile within 10 years, the transparency is not there. Certainly, that's one of the key reasons that President Trump has sought so strongly to pursue trilateral arms control and get China into the mix, because even as the deputy foreign minister in Russia said, it's time to multilateralize this. We can't get stuck in the Cold War paradigm of two powers doing arms control alone when there are other parties out there that greatly impact those kind of strategic balance equations. So as far as where we think we're going, deterrence is dynamic, not static. It is not, while we remain consistent with our core principles over the decades of nuclear deterrence policies and programs, it's not static. So the NPR recognized the reality of the changing geopolitical strategic environment and has stayed true to those core principles while recommending some supplemental capabilities. And that will continue regardless of administration. We'll continue to see adaptations in the force and in the enterprise as we go forward into the decades.
Thank you. Very interesting. So, Drew, I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll get ready to turn it over to the larger audience to ask questions. Cost is often cited as a reason not to go forward with military systems. From your perspective and thinking about your HASC experience, to what extent is the cost of NNSA and of our nuclear programs factor into what Congress does? Can you explain whether how the need for strategic modernization as the bedrock of our security transcends simple budget measures.
Sure. So, I mean, there is an enduring baseline cost of being a nuclear power at the level in which we are. You know, there's been studies by CBO and others to ways you could reduce the cost of the nuclear deterrent. And until you chop off a leg of the triad completely, you don't really save that much money in the grand scheme of things. And you know, it's been, as I said, consistent core principles of nuclear deterrence in the United States for 60 years on the triad. There doesn't seem to be much appetite on either side to do that. Whether you go back to Ash Carter, I mean, I'll read a quote from Secretary Carter. He said, "When I was Secretary of Defense and I stated when I was Secretary of Defense and continue to maintain it is essential to recapitalize the triad. It is the bedrock of deterrence. During the past 25 years, the United States has made no major new investments in its nuclear forces, yet other countries have conducted vigorous buildups. This history does not support the contention the U.S. investments fuel the nuclear programs of others. My views are reflected in the latest NPR," close quote. And Secretary Carter also talked about cost. I'll say, I was speaking to another group not too long ago, last week, with the former Undersecretary for the Comptroller from DOD, Mr. Hale, was on the line. And I recalled to him, he testified before the HASC and said, you know, during the Obama administration, they laid out the program of record. And they knew what they were laying out. They knew it was going to be challenging from a cost perspective, but they knew it was the right thing to do. And in that hearing, he said, you know, over the next team, whoever that is, because it was for the election, to execute that. Well, you know, we're here and we're executing. And as I said, we're fulfilling the commitments that were made. So at 5 to 6 to 7% of the defense budget at its peak, this is still a relative bargain for the #1 mission of the Department of Defense, to defend the nation and ultimately the nation's insurance policy. So I'm confident the administration will keep putting forward the funding that it believes it needs. Even in the COVID pandemic response, we've seen Secretary Esper talk about the need to continue to prioritize our nuclear modernization because we know we're out of margin and we're out of time.
Well, I really appreciate you giving us such clear and candid answers. Very much appreciated. I'm going to ask General Deptula to join us again, and I'm going to turn the program back over to him. General, you here?
Yeah, you bet, David. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Insightful questions. And thanks very much, Drew, again, for taking the time to share your insights with us today. On behalf of the ANWA Deterrence Center and AFA's Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, we really do wish you the very best in this era of ever increasing challenges.